Final unit is the reproductive system. Moving into the reproductive system, let's start by defining meiosis. We've already looked at the process of meiosis when we looked in Unit 3, Part 3, at the difference between meiosis and mitosis. Mitosis ultimately was cell division that led to two identical daughter cells being produced. We started off with one cell with 46 chromosomes, and we ended up with two cells with 46 chromosomes. They are identical copies to each other. This occurs in all the cells of the body except for the reproductive cells. Reproductive cells undergo meiosis. We've looked at meiosis as well. It's broken down into meiosis 1 and 2. And ultimately, the important point about meiosis is that it reduces the number of chromosomes by half, from the original 46 in the precursor sperm or egg cell to 23 chromosomes in the final sperm or egg cell that is produced. This is important in the end because the offspring that is formed, we'll take a look at that later on in this unit, will ultimately have 46 chromosomes in each of its cells. What ends up happening is that we have 23 chromosomes coming from the father and 23 chromosomes coming from the mother in order to form the offspring. And so meiosis is an important process in order to produce half the amount of chromosomes in both the sperm and the eggs, so that when they come together we have the full 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes, one set coming from the mother, one set coming from the father. Again, I would recommend you go back and look at the details from Unit 3, Part 3, in order to refresh your understanding of the difference between mitosis and meiosis. In order to study genetics, we often take pictures of cells, and we take pictures specifically of the chromosomes inside the cells in order to ask genetics-based questions. When we take a picture of all the chromosomes, we then enlarge it and actually cut out all the individual chromosomes in order to analyze them. We can actually match the pairs of chromosomes by lining them up in order from largest to smallest. Let's take a closer look at this image here. What we ultimately form is called a karyotype. This image here, as we just mentioned, lines up the chromosomes from largest to smallest. And what we end up with is the matching chromosomes, the 23 pairs that we mentioned earlier in this video and earlier in the cell unit when we talked about mitosis and meiosis. If we look at the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, these are called the autosomes. These carry the genes for all the various aspects that end up making up our bodies, because ultimately the genes that are found on these chromosomes code for how to make proteins that our body needs. If we looked at the cell here, inside the nucleus, we have these individual chromosomes, but on the various regions of the chromosomes, as we said, we'd lay out the DNA like this from the chromosome, and we have stretches that are genes that code for things like eye color and hair color or skin color. If we were to actually look at this pair, as I've been mentioning already, one of these chromosomes would be the chromosome that came from our mother. It would code for, again, eye color, hair color, or skin color at various regions along the chromosome. But we have a second chromosome from our father. And what that chromosome would have is actually the exact same regions, though maybe different versions of the genes that we ultimately get from our father. So here we're showing the DNA, one from one chromosome, one from the other. But each of the regions there code for the same genes. However, we might actually have different versions of those genes because our mother might be giving us a certain version and our father giving us a different version, or perhaps the same version. It depends on their genetics. The term we use for the different versions of genes are alleles. We're going to take a closer look at alleles here in a moment, but overall the allele refers to the different versions of the genes that I might have. So for example, eye color. I might get an allele from my mother that codes for brown eyes. I might get an allele, different version of the gene, from my father that codes for blue eyes. And I would have the one allele on the chromosome from my mother and the other allele on the chromosome from my father in the exact same region that codes for eye color on those two chromosomes. So let's take a look at and explain the difference between dominant and recessive genes. What this gets to is looking at how do those two versions, the different alleles, actually interact to produce, in the end, whatever physical trait I actually end up with. So we might have a situation like this, where perhaps my father has brown eyes, my mother has blue eyes, but I end up with brown eyes. How does that outcome actually come about, compared to someone who has a parent with blue eyes, another parent with blue eyes, and the result is that that person ends up with blue eyes? This comes to the idea again of dominant versus recessive genes or alleles. A dominant allele is an allele that, when present, dominates over any other allele. The recessive allele is an allele then that is recessive to or dominated over the dominant allele. So in this case what we have is we have an individual who has a father with brown eyes that passes on an allele for brown eyes. We have an individual who has, let's say, a mother with blue eyes, and she passes on an allele for blue eyes. So let's look at this situation that we have above. Let's say this is the father, and the father has an allele from his mother and from his father. Let's say in the case of this brown-eyed father, he has a dominant allele from his father and a dominant allele from his mother. In the end, the father here has brown eyes. The mother, in order to have blue eyes, must have two recessive alleles, one from her father and one from her mother. However, the offspring of these two parents would be a mixture of one allele from the father and one allele from the mother, such that this offspring has a dominant allele version and a recessive blue-eyed version. In the end, as we were mentioning before, the dominant allele wins out over the recessive allele such that this individual ends up with brown eyes. If we were to look at the other example that we looked at earlier, we have two blue-eyed parents having offspring that also have blue eyes. What we have going on here are the exact same alleles, where we have the dominant allele being brown and the recessive alleles being blue. The father with blue eyes must have two recessive alleles in order for him to actually have the trait for blue eyes. The mother must have the same code, where she has two recessive alleles. In the end, the only outcome for offspring for these parents would be individuals with a small b from the father and a small b from the mother. Therefore, all the offspring will end up with blue eyes. Now let's discuss the chromosomes involved in sex determination. Again, we looked at the karyotype earlier on, and we looked at the first 22 pairs, which are autosomes. They hold all the genes that ultimately code for the various traits of the person. The final 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. These determine the sex of the offspring. Let's take a look here at the adults. We have a male who, by definition, has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. We have the female who, by definition, has two X chromosomes. What happens is the male will make sperm and the female will make eggs through the process of meiosis, as we discussed earlier. Because in the sperm you only end up with one chromosome of all the 23 chromosomes in each sperm, the type of sperm that the male make will either carry an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. The same thing for eggs, because through the process of meiosis, you end up with eggs that only have one copy of all the 23 chromosomes. Eggs end up with one X chromosome. As you'll note, it is ultimately the male who determines the sex of the offspring because he's the only one that can pass on a Y chromosome, which dictates that the individual becomes a male, versus the female who can only pass on an X to her offspring. There are various combinations here. If we have an egg that is fertilized by a sperm that has an X chromosome in it, we will end up with a daughter because we will have two X chromosomes, which again by definition means that it is a female. We can have a situation where the egg with the X chromosome is fertilized by a sperm with a Y chromosome, and what we will end up with then is a male offspring.